Frost coated the glass thick enough to scrape with a heavy hunting knife, but that sound outside woke me. Boots crunching on frozen mud. Nobody came up this ridge in November unless lost, running, or looking to die. I reached out for the scarred wood of my old Winchester rifle. The floorboards were ice under my bare feet. I stood from the cot, the old ache in my left knee grinding like two dry stones. 52 winters leave a mark on a man's joints. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the draft vent of the cast-iron stove where last night's coals still held a dull, sullen heat. I didn't light a lantern. I slipped my suspenders over my thermal shirt, stepped into my boots, and left the laces trailing. The lever of the Winchester clicked back with a heavy, oiled metallic slide. A round chambered. In the silence of a high-country dawn, that sound usually stops whatever is moving outside. The footsteps didn't stop. They dragged. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The cold hit my lungs like inhaled needles. The sky was the bruised purple of early morning, and the timberline stood stark and black against the snow. 3 inches had fallen in the night. The wind had stripped the powder from the packed earth around my porch, leaving patches of frozen mud. There, near the chopping block, was a shape. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a drifter looking to rob me. It was a woman. She was huddled against the stacked cortwood, a thin wool coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't look up when the door opened. She didn't flinch at the rifle in my hands. I lowered the hammer on the Winchester and leaned it against the door frame. "Hey," I said. My voice was rough, unaccustomed to use. A man alone in the mountains goes weeks without hearing his own voice. Sometimes he forgets what it sounds like. She didn't move. I stepped off the porch. The snow crunched under my boots. I reached her and crouched down, ignoring the protest in my knee. Her face was buried in her arms. Frost clung to the loose strands of dark hair that had escaped her hood. I grabbed her shoulder. Hard. You don't shake someone gently when the cold has them. You have to wake the blood. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, vacant, rimmed with red. Her lips were cracked and blue. She looked at me, but I knew she didn't see a man. She just saw a shape in the dark. "Get up," I said. She opened her mouth. A sound came out, thin and broken, like dry leaves scraping across stone. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped sideways against the woodpile. I swore, a short, sharp word that lost itself in the wind. I didn't want her here. I came to this ridge 10 years ago to get away from the towns, the noise, the desperate needs of other people. I had enough supplies to last the winter. I had quiet. Now, I had a dying woman in my yard. I hooked my arms under hers and lifted. She was light. Too light. The coat was nothing, but cheap wool and cotton lining soaked through at the hem where she dragged herself through the drifts. I hoisted her over my shoulder like a sack of grain. Inside, I kicked the door shut and threw the latch. I laid her out on the floorboards near the stove. The cabin was barely warmer than outside, but the wind was gone. I opened the stove door, threw in some kindling and a split log of dry pine, and blew on the embers. The fire caught with a low roar. I turned back to her. Hypothermia is a quiet killer. It lulls you to sleep. It convinces you that you are warm right before the end. I knelt beside her and started peeling off the layers. There was no room for modesty. The wet coat came off first, heavy and stiff, with frozen meltwater. Her hands were curled into tight fists, the knuckles white and waxy. I rubbed them between my own calloused palms, creating friction, watching for the skin to flush. She wore a faded cotton dress underneath. It was damp at the knees. I pulled my heavy wool blanket from the cot and wrapped her in it tightly, cocooning her. She shivered. A violent full-body tremor. Good. Shivering meant the body was fighting. I filled the tin coffee pot from the water bucket, breaking the thin layer of ice on top with my thumb, and set it on the stove. I sat back on my heels and finally looked at her face. She was young, mid-20s maybe. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, a scattering of freckles across a nose that looked like it had been broken and set slightly crooked a long time ago. She wasn't soft. The skin on her hands was rough, the fingernails chipped. She had the look of someone who worked for everything she had and still ended up with nothing. The water boiled. I found a clean rag, dipped it in the hot water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against her frozen cheeks and forehead. She groaned and turned her head away from the heat. "Hold still," I muttered. I brewed a strong, bitter cup of chicory, added a generous spoonful of sugar, and propped her head up. "Drink." I pressed the tin rim to her lips. She choked on the first swallow, coughing weakly, but then the instinct to survive kicked in. She drank greedily, her throat working. When the cup was empty, I laid her head back down on a rolled-up saddle blanket. The violent shivering had subsided into a steady tremor. Her color was better. I stood up, my knees cracking loudly in the quiet room. I walked to the window and looked out at the falling snow. The tracks she had made coming up the ridge were already filling in. By noon, they would be gone. It would be as if she had dropped out of the sky. I didn't know who she was or what she was running from. I only knew that the pass down to the valley would be blocked by 6 feet of snow by the end of the week. She was here until spring. I looked at my narrow cot, my single plate on the shelf, my solitary chair by the fire. The silence of the cabin was gone, shattered the moment she took her first breath inside these walls. I gripped the windowsill until my knuckles turned white, staring at the snow, feeling a tight, heavy dread settle in my chest. She woke 2 days later. I was at the table, running an oiled rag over the disassembled parts of my revolver. The smell in the cabin was sharp with Hoppy's No. 9 solvent, wood smoke, and the salted pork I had fried for breakfast. The rustle of the wool blanket made me pause. I didn't look up. I slid the cylinder back into the frame and locked it in place. "Where am I?" Her voice was a rasp, stripped raw by the cold. "North ridge of the Blacktooth," I said, laying the gun on the table. "About 20 miles from the nearest claim." I turned my chair. She was sitting up on my cot, clutching the blanket to her chin. Her dark eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the drying meat hanging from the rafters, the stacked firewood, the rifles on the wall, and finally me. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She evaluated. "You found me. You found me," I corrected. "I just dragged you inside before the cold finished the job." She swallowed hard. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're trapped." I stood up and walked to the stove. I poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her, stopping a few feet from the bed. I held it out. She hesitated, then reached a hand out from the blanket. Her fingers brushed mine. Her hand was warm now. Mine were rough, covered in scars from skinning knives and barbed wire. She took the cup and wrapped both hands around it. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ruth?" "Amos." I turned my back to her and went back to the table. I wiped down the barrel of the revolver. "I need to get to Oakhaven," she said after a long silence. "Oakhaven is 30 miles down into the valley. I can walk it." I let out a short, dry laugh. "You wouldn't make it to the tree line. The snow is waist-deep in the draws, and another storm is pushing in over the divide." You try to walk to Oakhaven now, I'll be digging your bones out of the mud in May." She stared into her coffee cup. The steam curled around her face. "I can't stay here. You don't have a choice. And neither do I." I shoved the rag into a tin can and picked up the revolver, holstering it. "I'll take the floor," I said. "You keep the cot. I've got enough beans, flour, and dried venison to see 2 people through to the thaw, provided we portion it right. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours." She looked up at me. "I won't be a burden. I can work. There's no work for you to do. Just stay warm and don't die." The first 2 weeks were a study in avoidance. The cabin was 12 by 16 feet. Moving around each other required a choreographed silence. If I was at the stove, she sat on the cot. If she was at the wash basin, I was outside chopping wood. She tried to help. I caught her trying to sweep the floor with a bundle of pine boughs she'd tied together. I took it from her hands. "I can clean," I told her, tossing the makeshift broom into the fire. "I hate sitting still," she fired back, her chin jutting out. It was the first time she had raised her voice. "Learn to like it." She glared at me, her eyes flashing in the dim light. "I am not a child, Amos, and I am not an invalid. Stop treating me like something broken that you have to step around." I looked at her, really looked at her. She stood straight, her jaw tight, defiance rolling off her in waves. The bruised look she had when she arrived was gone, replaced by a hardened edge. "Fine," I said softly. The next morning, I didn't make the coffee. I stayed on my bedroll on the floor and watched her navigate the stove. She was clumsy with the heavy iron door at first, but she figured out the draft. She ground the beans, boiled the water, and fried the hardtack in bacon grease without asking for help. She set a tin plate on the table, poured 2 cups, and sat down. I rolled up my blankets, pulled on my boots, and joined her. We ate in silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the first 2 weeks. It was just quiet. I finished my plate, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, and looked at her. "Wood needs splitting," I said. "You can stack it on the porch." A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. All right, that was the treaty. We didn't talk about Oakhaven. We didn't talk about what drove her into a blizzard with nothing but a thin coat. I didn't talk about why I lived at the edge of the world. We talked about the wood supply. We talked about the ice on the creek. We talked about the meat in the stores. I watched her work. She was relentless. She stacked wood until her hands blistered. Then she wrapped them in rags and stacked more. When the wind howled and shook the cabin walls, she sat by the fire and meticulously mended the tears in her coat with a bone needle and heavy thread. She had grit. I respected grit. It was the only currency that mattered up here. But respect is a dangerous thing for a man who is used to isolation. It makes you pay attention. I found myself noticing the way the firelight caught the dark strands of her hair. I noticed the sharp, precise movements of her hands. I noticed the way the cabin felt empty when she stepped outside to fetch water. A cold void settling in my chest until the door opened, and she stepped back in, bringing the scent of pine and frost with her. I didn't like it. I didn't want to notice. One evening in late December, the wind dropped, leaving a deafening stillness over the mountain. The temperature plummeted. The cold radiated through the log walls. A physical presence pressing in on us. I was sitting at the table, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone. The steady shh of steel on stone was the only sound. Ruth was on the cot, wrapped in her blanket and reading an old worn copy of a natural history book she had found on my shelf. "Did you build this place?" she asked suddenly. I paused the blade. "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." "Why here?" I resumed, sharpening. "Shh. Trees don't ask for much. Rocks don't expect anything." She closed the book and set it aside. "People expected a lot from you?" "Enough." I didn't look at her, but I could feel her eyes on me, piercing, trying to pry up the floorboards of my past. "My husband was a miner," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, devoid of grief. "He chased gold from Dakota to Nevada, never found it. Found a lot of whiskey, though. Found a lot of men willing to lend him money at bad rates." I stopped the knife. I waited. "He died in a cave-in last October," she continued. "The men he owed money to decided the debt passed to me. They came to the boarding house. Told me I could work it off. The kind of work a woman doesn't walk away from." She took a breath, slow and measured. I waited until they were drunk, packed what I could carry, and walked out. Traded my good boots to a wagon driver to get as far as the foothills. Walked the rest of the way until the snow hit. I looked down at the blade in my hand. It was sharp enough to shave with. "They won't come up here," I said. "I know. Come spring, I'll take you over the divide. There's a rail stop 50 miles west. They won't look for you there. Thank you." I wiped the blade clean and sheathed it. I stood up and walked to the door, grabbing my heavy coat. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Check the snares. It's pitch black out there. I know the way." I stepped out into the freezing night, shutting the door behind me. I stood on the porch, my breath pluming in the moonlight. I didn't go to the snares. I just stood there, letting the bitter cold bite through my shirt, trying to freeze out the sudden, terrifying urge I had felt to walk over to that cot and put my arms around her. January broke the mountain. A blizzard rolled in from the north and sat on the ridge for 5 days. The snow piled up past the lower window panes. The wind screamed down the chimney, blowing smoke back into the room. We lived in a twilight world of kerosene lamps and the red glow of the stove. Cabin fever is a physical affliction. It makes your skin itch. It makes the air feel thick and breathable only in shallow gasps. By the 3rd day, the silence we had built our truce upon shattered. I was pacing, 4 steps from the door to the stove. Turn, 4 steps back. "Stop," she said. She was sitting at the table, a pile of dried beans spread out in front of her. She was picking out the stones and the shriveled ones. I stopped mid-stride. "I need to move. Then do something useful. Your pacing is rattling the floorboards." I stared at her. "There's nothing to do. We're buried. Then sit down." I didn't sit. I walked to the window and stared at the wall of white snow pressing against the glass. "I should have left you in the yard," I muttered. It was a lie, and a cruel one, born of confined spaces and frustration. The sound of the beans shifting on the table stopped. I closed my eyes, regretting the words instantly. "You didn't, though," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly calm. I turned around. She was looking right at me. "You didn't," she repeated. "You carried me in. You gave me your bed. You feed me. You protect me. So don't stand there and act like you're some heartless bastard who only cares about himself, Amos." I walked over to the table, placing my hands flat on the rough wood, leaning over her. "You don't know me, Ruth." She looked up, holding my gaze. "I know that you haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since I got here because you're listening to the wind, making sure the roof holds. I know you give me the larger cut of meat. I know you. I'm keeping you alive. That's survival. That's all it is it?" She stood up. The table was small, and standing brought her close. too close. I could smell the harsh lye soap she used on her hair, mixed with the natural, warm scent of her skin. I could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. I stepped back. Putting distance between us, my chest felt tight. "Don't do this," I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly low. "Do what?" she challenged, stepping forward. "Don't look for something that isn't here." I pointed a calloused finger at my own chest. "Look at me. Look at this." I gestured to the gray in my beard, the deep lines carved into my face by sun and wind, the stiff way I held my left shoulder where a horse had kicked me 20 years ago. I am old, Ruth. I am hard. I have lived alone by choice because I don't know how to live any other way. My hands are built for killing and skinning and chopping wood. They aren't built for holding. She looked at my hands. Her expression didn't change. "I didn't ask you to hold me," she said softly. "You're thinking about it," I shot back, the honesty tearing its way out of me before I could stop it. "I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. I feel it." She didn't deny it. She just stood there, her dark eyes locked onto mine. I said. I lowered my voice, forcing the words out like stones. "You're too young for an old mountain man. You have a whole life down in the valley. You go to that rail stop in the spring. You go west, you find a young man with a future, not a ghost haunting a ridge." The silence stretched. The wind hammered against the walls, rattling the heavy timber, but inside, the air was entirely still. She took a slow breath. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She took one step closer. The tip of her boot touched mine. She reached out. I went rigid. I expected her to touch my face or my chest. Instead, she took my right hand. She didn't hold it like a lover. She held it like she was examining a tool. She ran her thumb over the thick calluses on my palm, the crooked joint of my index finger, the white scar slashing across the knuckles. I tried to pull back, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She looked up from my hand, meeting my eyes. There was no pity in her face, no starry-eyed romance, just a quiet, absolute certainty. And she whispered, "To me, you're perfect." She dropped my hand and walked back to the cot, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders and picking up her book. I stood in the center of the cabin, my hands still half raised in the empty air, feeling a tectonic shift beneath my feet that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The mountain was breaking, and so was I. Stories like this one are best told in the quiet of the night, when the fire burns down to coals and the wind howls outside. If you want to pull up a chair and hear how Amos and Ruth fare when the spring thaw finally comes, just leave a like and share this tale. Subscribe to keep your place by our fire. We have a lot more ground to cover together. Stay warm, and I will see you next time. February bled into March, and the mountain began to change its tune. It started with a drip, a slow, agonizingly irregular rhythm from the eaves of the roof. Then came the groaning of the ice on the creek down in the draw, a deep, hollow sound like timber snapping under pressure. The snowpack shrank, pulling back from the trunks of the pines, leaving rings of bare, dark earth. The physical confinement of the cabin gave way to a different kind of tension, the kind that comes from too much space. We were outside more now. The air was still sharp enough to crack your lips, but the midday sun carried a heavy, wet warmth. The world smelled of pine needles, wet bark, and thawing mud. Ruth took to the changing season with a restless energy. She found an old pair of snowshoes I'd woven from ash wood and rawhide 5 years ago. They were too big for her boots, so she spent 3 evenings by the stove, meticulously unlacing and retying the bindings with strips of oiled leather until they fit. I watched her work. I watched her a lot these days. Since that night in January, we hadn't spoken of what passed between us. The words, "To me, you're perfect," hung in the rafters, settling into the dust, absorbing into the logs. I ignored them. The best I could. I fell back on the only defense I had ever known: work, silence, and distance. But distance is a tricky thing when you share the same breathing air for 4 months. One afternoon, I was down by the creek, kneeling in the slush, checking a line of snare wire I'd set for winter hares. The water was running fast and black, carrying chunks of gray ice down toward the valley. My knees ached. The damp cold seeped through the wool of my trousers, biting into the old joint. I heard the crunch of the snowshoes before I saw her. She stopped beside me, a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. She had been gathering deadwood from the lower slopes. "Too empty," I said, not looking up. I twisted the copper wire, snapping the snare loose from the sapling. "Game is moving higher, following the melt." "Then we go higher tomorrow," she said. I stood up, wincing as the knee locked, then popped. I staggered a half-step, my boot slipping on a patch of slick mud hidden beneath the pine straw. Her hand shot out, catching my forearm. Her grip was tight, her boots braced against the incline. She steadied me. We stood there for a long moment. The rush of the creek filled our ears. Her hand burned through the thick wool of my sleeve. I looked down at her face. The harsh mountain sun had tanned her skin, bringing out a dusting of freckles across her cheeks. The exhaustion that had marked her when she arrived was gone. She looked wild. She looked like she belonged here. I pulled my arm away. Deliberately, not fast, but firm. "I can stand on my own," I grumbled, picking up my rifle from where I'd leaned it against a spruce. "I know you can, Amos," she replied, her voice level. "But you don't always have to." She turned and walked back up the trail toward the cabin, the snowshoes kicking up small sprays of slush. I watched her go, a hard, uncomfortable knot tightening in my gut. I was a man built for winter. I knew how to survive the freeze. The thaw was what terrified me. By mid-April, the snow was gone from the southern ridges, leaving behind a slick, treacherous expanse of mud and scree. The pass down to Oak Haven was still snowed in on the northern face, but a man on foot could make it through if he knew the sheer drops and didn't mind a little suffering. I told her I was going scouting. I needed to see if the game trails were clear. It was a lie. I needed to see if the world had remembered we were up here. I took the Winchester, 50 rounds of ammunition and a canvas bedroll, and hiked down past the timberline. The descent was brutal. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my leg. The air grew thicker, heavier, tasting of dust and blooming sage. 3 miles above the valley floor, where the trail narrows into a steep switchback known as Dead Man's Wash, I found them. Not men. Tracks. I knelt in the dirt, the brim of my hat pulled low against the glaring sun. 3 sets of boot prints, fresh, less than a day old. 2 sets were standard leather soles, wearing down at the heels. But the 3rd set was deep, heavy, laced with iron hobnails. The kind of boots issued to the enforcers at the mining camps. They were coming up. Slowly, methodically, fighting the mud and the altitude. I touched the edge of the hobnail print. The dirt was still crumbly. They hadn't come all this way to hunt elk. They were hunting the woman who owed them blood money. I stood up, sweeping my gaze over the switchback. I could set an ambush here, drop them from the ridge before they ever saw my face. It would be easy, clean, but They had horses waiting down below, likely. If they didn't come back, more would come looking. They would burn the mountain down to find her. I turned around and started the long climb back to the cabin. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to breathe. I walked until my lungs burned and the metallic taste of adrenaline coated the back of my throat. When I reached the clearing, the sun was dropping behind the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Ruth was on the porch, a wooden bucket of water in her hands. She saw my face and stopped. She didn't ask how the hunting was. She set the bucket down. "How many?" she asked. "3," I said, crossing the yard in long strides. I stepped up onto the porch and pushed past her into the cabin. 1 heavy, 2 light mining boots. They're about 6 miles down the trail. They'll camp tonight at the wash. They'll be here by noon tomorrow. I walked straight to the back wall and pulled down my shotgun, a sawed-off double barrel. I cracked the breech, checked the bores, and snapped it shut with a sharp, heavy clack. Ruth stood in the doorway, her silhouette dark against the failing light. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I can leave. I can lead them away." I threw a box of buckshot onto the table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "You'd make it 2 miles before they caught you," I said, pulling the heavy oak table away from the wall and dragging it toward the window to create a barricade. "And I don't give up what's on my mountain." I stopped dragging the table and looked at her. Really looked at her. "Get inside," I said, my voice dropping its harsh edge. "Bar the door when I tell you." They arrived right when the sun hit its zenith, bleaching the color out of the rocks. I was sitting on the chopping block in the front yard. I had a whetstone in my hand, running it slowly down the edge of my skinning knife. The Winchester was leaning against the stump, right by my right knee. Inside the cabin, the shutters were closed, barred from the inside. Ruth was sitting on the floor behind the stove, out of the line of fire. She had the revolver. I had showed her how to thumb the hammer back. I told her if the door opened and it wasn't me, to empty the cylinder and not stop pulling the trigger until it clicked. The 3 men came out of the tree line. They were exhausted, covered in dried mud and sweat. Their horses left miles below where the trail grew too steep. The man in the lead was big, wearing a dust-covered bowler hat and a heavy canvas duster. He had the hobnailed boots. The other 2 were wiry, nervous-looking men with revolvers strapped low on their hips. They stopped 20 yards from the porch. They looked at the cabin, then at me. "Long climb for a social call," I said. I didn't stop dragging the stone over the blade. The big man stepped forward. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snowmelt. "Looking for a woman, dark hair, about yay high. Goes by Ruth. She stole something that belongs to the company. Only things up here are rocks, timber, and me," I said, testing the edge of the knife against my thumb. "And none of us belong to your company." The big man smiled. It was an ugly thing, a stretching of chapped lips over yellow teeth. "We tracked her from the foothills, old man. We know she came up this ridge. You're going to step aside, or we're going to put you in the dirt and take down that door." I stopped, sharpening the knife. I laid it on the block. "I came to this mountain," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the thin air, "because down there men like you run things. Men who think a piece of paper or a bad debt means you own another human being." I rested my hand on the stock of the Winchester. "Up here, the only thing you own is what you can hold." The big man's eyes shifted. He dropped his hand toward his coat. I didn't wait to see the iron. At 52, my knees were shot and my back ached, but my hands remembered their brutal geometry. I swept the Winchester up by the lever, racking around in a single fluid motion. I fired from the hip. The rifle roared, a deafening crack that shattered the stillness. The heavy .44-40 slug caught the big man square in the chest. The force of it threw him backward into the mud, his duster flaring out around him like broken wings. The other two scrambled. One dove behind the woodpile. The other, panicking, drew his pistol and fired wild. The bullet tore through the air, clipping the upper edge of my left shoulder. It felt like a hot poker being dragged across the meat. I didn't flinch. I leveled the Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and put a round through the panicking man's thigh. He screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his leg as he collapsed into the slush. Silence slammed back. The yard the man behind the woodpile hadn't fired. I could hear his ragged breathing. I levered another round. Clack, clack. "You want to die for a mining company's ledger?" I called out, my voice grating like iron. "Or do you want to carry your friend down the mountain?" A long, agonizing pause. Then a revolver came sailing over the top of the woodpile, landing in the mud. The wiry man stood out, his hands raised, his eyes wide and fixed on the barrel of my rifle. "Pick him up," I ordered, gesturing with the muzzle to the screaming man on the ground. "Leave the dead one. I'll bury him. You go back down to Oakhaven, and you tell your bosses the trail is closed. If anyone else comes up here, I won't ask questions. I'll just shoot." The man didn't speak. He hauled his bleeding companion to his feet, threw the man's arm over his shoulder, and began the slow, agonizing drag back toward the tree line. I stood there, the rifle leveled, until they disappeared into the pines. Then I lowered the gun. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sweeping exhaustion. I looked down at my left shoulder. The heavy wool of my coat was torn, and blood was beginning to soak through, dark and wet. The heavy bar on the cabin door scraped back. The door opened. Ruth stood there, the revolver hanging loose in her hand. She looked at the dead man in the yard, then at the blood on my coat. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked over to me, took the Winchester from my hand, and leaned it against the porch rail. She slid her arm around my waist, supporting my uninjured side. "Let's get you inside," she said. Her voice was steady as bedrock. The wound wasn't deep. The bullet had taken a groove of flesh and bypassed the bone. She stripped my coat off, cut away the bloodied thermal shirt, and washed the wound with boiling water and harsh brown soap. I gripped the edge of the table, biting down on a leather strap as she poured raw iodine into the furrow. Her hands were quick, competent, and gentle. When she finished binding the shoulder with clean linen strips, she stepped back. "I owe you my life, Amos," she whispered. I pulled my good shirt over my head, wincing. "You don't owe me anything. Debts don't exist up here." 2 weeks later, the pass was completely clear. The mud had hardened, the grass was pushing up green through the dead pine needles, and the air smelled of wild flowers. It was time. I saddled my buckskin gelding and packed a spare mule with provisions, dried meat, flour, a thick wool blanket, and a small canvas bag containing $300 in gold double eagles. Every cent I had saved over 10 years of trapping. Ruth walked out onto the porch. She wore her mended coat and carried a small canvas grip. We didn't speak much on the 2-day ride to the rail stop. The journey down the mountain felt like a funeral procession. With every mile we descended, the air grew hotter, thicker, louder. The silence of the high country was replaced by the clatter of wagons, the shouting of men, the distant, mechanical shriek of a steam whistle. We reached the station just as the midday train from Denver was pulling in. It was a massive breathing iron beast, belching black coal smoke into the blue sky. I dismounted and tied the horses to a hitching post. I pulled her canvas grip from the mule. We stood on the wooden platform. People brushed past us, men in suits, women in elaborate dresses. I felt massive, clumsy, and dirty in my buckskins and worn boots. I didn't belong here. I belonged in the cold. I turned to her. I held out the grip, and on top of it, I placed the small canvas bag of coins and a train ticket printed on heavy cardstock. "This goes straight through to San Francisco," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The money is enough to set you up, buy a room, find work, start over." She didn't reach for the bags. She looked at the ticket, then up at the train, taking in the soot, the noise, the crushing weight of the world she had run from. Then she looked at me. "I told you," she said, her voice cutting through the hiss of the steam engine. "I don't belong down here anymore, Amos." "You have a whole life ahead of you," I repeated, a desperate hollow echo of my own earlier words. "You can't stay on that mountain. It's a hard life. It's an old man's life." "It's my life," she corrected fiercely. She took the train ticket from my hand. For a second, I thought she was going to board. Instead, she tore the heavy cardstock in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall onto the dusty planks of the platform. She picked up her canvas grip. She didn't take the gold. "Are we going home, Amos?" she asked, her dark eye locking onto mine, stripping away every defense I had left. "Or are you going to make me walk all the way back up that ridge by myself?" I looked at the shredded ticket. I looked at the massive iron train, and then I looked at the woman standing in front of me, fierce, unyielding, a force of nature as undeniable as the spring thaw. The tight, suffocating armor I had worn for 10 years finally cracked and floatway. I reached out and took the grip from her hand. "The trail's steep," I said, a slow, rough smile breaking across my face for the first time in a decade. "You'd best ride." I turned my back on the train, the noise and the valley, and we walked back to the horses, ready to climb the mountain we both called home. This story ends here, but the long trail stretches on. If this tale of the high country, cold steel, and quiet defiance struck a chord with you, leave a like and share it with those who appreciate a story built on solid ground. Subscribe to the channel to keep your place by our fire. We tell the stories of the forgotten, the rugged, and the real. Join our community, and let's ride out together when the next great story begins.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, I said, "You're too young for an old mountain man," and she whispered to me, "You're perfect." I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me was the tenderness behind accepting someone for who they are, instead of letting age or self-doubt decide what's possible. Sometimes we see our own flaws much more clearly than the people who genuinely care about us do. Do you think age should matter when two people truly understand each other? Have you ever had someone help you see yourself differently? Maybe we can all practice listening before deciding what someone else should feel or choose. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like and subscribe.